Hey, Shell Point, John High, Academy Manager, here to give a brief introduction to this next lecture by Professor Adrian Kerr. Now, there's a number of you that have been listening to Professor Kerr speak in our academy for a number of years, right? And there's some of you, this may be your very first time. I'm excited for you because I really think you're going to enjoy getting to hear him present. We've known Professor Kerr to be a world traveler, educated historian, and an enlightened communicator. We also knew that it wouldn't take him very long to put together a presentation that will help us better understand our current situation and give us a historical perspective. This session is entitled Plagues, a Long and Unpleasant History. Professor Kerr is going to help us travel back through time in history, and as we just study where disease, pandemics, and plagues have had a profound impact on human history. Professor Kerr, we would also want to take a quick moment and say thank you to you for the many years in which you have contributed to the Academy of Lifelong Learning here at Shell Point. We appreciate all the time and effort that you have given to it. Now, take it away, Professor Kerr.
Good day, this is Adrian Kerr saying hello to my colleagues in Shell Point. As you can see, I'm actually recording this in my home office because we're restricting our movements, which I respect. So I was slightly frustrated, but I learned that we could possibly use the TV method to transmit this to you. So I'm going to have a go at giving a presentation of a new subject, which in fact was triggered by the difficulties that we're going through at the moment, which is the pandemic of the coronavirus. So this one is called Plagues, a Long and Unpleasant History. The first slide you can see is a rather scary picture of a 17th century doctor who, just like we do in current times, try to protect themselves by wearing some sort of mask. This one has made out of leather, and it's got eye points, and it's also got a filter in its beak, but it's very scary indeed. But this is the kind of person who would come to you during the Black Death, for instance, to see if you were making progress. I'm going to start off with the oldest recorded epidemic on the planet, which is 3000 BC in northeast China. And a village was found by archaeologists which had a very large number of skeletons had been dumped into a pit and then later burnt. And so this is the oldest surviving evidence of a pandemic in the area of northeast China. There's no age differentiation. There were children and older people there. They found other villages which had also been attacked by the disease, and there's no time for burial, no energy to put them separately. And in fact, this village was never occupied again. It was considered cursed, and so this was the end of this particular village in China. And there are a few more like that. This dates back to 5,000 years ago. I'm going to move forward to the next endemic, which is typhoid. And this has a typical death rate of 15%. So this is very serious to the people who lived before modern medicine. It's based on Salmonella, and you get red blotches. It's really caused by contact with feces, with food or water, and has declined over the last 100 years or so. One of the interesting observations of why it's got less typhoid outbreak is that the number of horses and therefore horse manure and therefore flies has declined with the motor vehicle, and that's reduced the likelihood of this outbreak. And of course what finally killed it off was the modern concept of chlorinating drinking water, which gets rid of the bugs. In 1896, this English chemist, a guy called Wright, discovered the first vaccine. So from then onwards we were winning. In 1897 the UK started chlorinating its water. So that's over 100 years ago. Over here in the United States, there's the infamous case of the first tracked carrier of a disease. She's nicknamed Typhoid Mary, and she was found to have brought the disease into the United States, and she tracked all the people who she made contact with, who then subsequently got typhoid, and that became the modern practice of tracking people who are contaminated. But it's still around the rest of the world, as you can see from this map. The dark red spots is where you can get typhoid if you're unfortunate. Then in 2000 there were 22 million cases and 200,000 people died of typhoid, so it's still alive and relatively well. If we go back to ancient Greece, Around about 400 and so BC, you can see from this next slide that Athens and Sparta had been fighting for many years. The in fact war, the Peloponnese War as they're called, lasted for 100 years between the major cities in Greece. The war between Athens and Sparta dragged on for 5 years. There was shortage of food, squalor, and the city of Athens was surrounded by the Spartans, and there's an outbreak of a disease and 100,000 people died. A local writer described the attack, the violent heats in the head, redness, inflammation in the eyes, the throat and tongue becoming bloody and emitting an unnatural and fetid breath. It sounds terrible. What is it? Well, of course, they weren't scientific folks, so they just described the impact on humans. We think it was either typhoid or Ebola, but the war carried on and eventually Sparta won because Athens had been devastated by the plague. The next unpleasant virus is the smallpox, and it's even in the last 100 years or so, smallpox is very well known and is now fortunately become eradicated. It's a virus with a very high death rate. 30% of people who contracted smallpox would die. The analysis that the medical folk have done has shown that this virus is very old. It goes back to 68,000 years ago because the DNA of creatures, particularly African rats, have demonstrated that smallpox was carried by them 68,000 years ago. In terms of humans, the oldest example of smallpox in humans was Egyptian times, around about 200 BC. It was found in an Egyptian mummy. By the 17th century, this was a major repetitive plague in Europe, where typically 400,000 people died each year throughout Europe due to smallpox. And then Jenner, an English biochemist in 1798, discovered a vaccine, and he found it in a milder version called cowpox. The word cowpox is from the Latin meaning cow is vacca, hence the word vaccine. So the word vaccine comes from his work, and he's considered the pioneer of immunization. But it's still with us. In 1967, there were 15 million cases. In the 100 years up to 2000, 300 million people died from smallpox. And this is a very sad picture on the right-hand side of this young girl who's contracted smallpox in 1973. But progress was made. By 1977, it was the last recorded natural case, and therefore in 1980, the World Health Organization confidently declared smallpox has been eradicated. We now move on to Roman times, and one of the causes of the Roman Empire's collapse is the plague. There were a number of outbreaks, but the worst ones were in 165 AD and 189, and it was brought back to Rome from the troops after their victory in Ctesiphon fighting Iran, and they brought back an unwelcome visitor, smallpox. Could have been measles, but most likely smallpox. And at the same time, this disease had spread from the Middle East to China, because Han China's records show that there was a huge outbreak for 20 years of the plague. 2,000 people were dying a day, a quarter of the people who caught the disease died, and in Rome, 5 million people in totality died of smallpox. And it's called the Antonine Plague because these were the 4 emperors who were affected by it, and 10% of the empire had died. And if you can see the bottom right-hand corner, the 2 emperors who actually succumbed to this was the famous Marcus Aurelius and his successor Verus. Mass graves have been found all over Rome from this outbreak in the catacombs, and 20,000 bodies were found in England. The impact on the smallpox outbreak of those 2 periods cannot be overstated. It savaged the army, and the Pax Romana, which had kept Europe relatively quiet for 200 years, was coming to an end. The cause of this reduction in people and taxation and central government meant that there were more civil wars, and eventually the barbarians overwhelmed the Romans, as you know, around about 450 AD. And so it was in the bottom right-hand corner. You can see how Rome disappeared. And one of the contributing factors, most historians would agree, was these plagues, which reduced the population significantly. Moving slightly forward, the Bishop of Carthage in 250 or so AD declared the end of the world when another outbreak occurred. 5,000 people per day were dying in Rome, and once again this was an outbreak of smallpox. It spread throughout the Roman world into North Africa, and in Luxor there is a burial site where many people who had been died from disease were thrown into a pit covered with lime, and then burnt and covered over with soil. So this had spread throughout Europe and also into North Africa around about 270 AD. Now we come on to one of the most hated of the plagues, the bubonic plague. And the word bubonic comes from the Greek word meaning a bubon. And this picture on the right-hand side shows an expanded lymph node where you get these growths in the area of the lymph. And it comes from that lovely little creature on the right-hand side. The famous Yersinia pestis comes from a flea. And here's a picture of the flea, and you can see that he has got this dark mass infecting its body, and that is what passes on to humans. From handling dead animals where there are fleas on them, and you can see the spread over the time as these people pass the disease from one to another. Very high fatality rate. 50% of people died of the plague within 10 days. If they're vaccinated, which there is a vaccine now, there's still a 10% chance of dying. And the areas which are still affected by the bubonic plague is the Congo in Africa and Peru in South America. I mention that because the bubonic plague becomes the popular, if that's the right word, plague in the ancient world. And the next occurrence we see is 540 AD, the great Emperor Justinian, shown here on the right-hand side, who had rebuilt Rome and taken back much of the empire which had been taken by the barbarians. Suffered terribly. 10% of the Roman world died in 540 AD, and the Byzantine Empire could never once again expand to the point of the ancient Western Empire. However, there were great things being done at this time in the Byzantine Empire, called Constantinople, now Istanbul, and this beautiful basilica was built at the time of Justinian on the right-hand side, which of course you all know well is Hagia Sophia. Meanwhile, in Japan, a few hundred years later, the smallpox epidemic took over. A third of the population of Japan died in a period of the 8th century. It's brought in from Korea by fishermen, and the shock to the Japanese people was so great that they turned to religion, and the emperor even built the largest bronze Buddha in the world at that time, which is 45 feet high, and it survived this time. So this is 1300 years ago. Because there were less people to till the fields and gather the crops, the rice harvests collapsed, and the government was very concerned about taxation and the welfare of the population. And so two measures of stimulus, which we can talk about today, of course, the government's making stimulus measures. Well, this is 1300 years ago. The emperor said that there's going to be a tax exemption to the whole country for the year. So that would be a very positive move. And to help the farmers rebuild the food production, land was given by private individuals to farmers so that the rice harvest could come back again. That was 1300 years ago in Japan. This slide is the one you've been waiting for. This is the worst event in the history of the planet. And just so serious that many artists were now depressed and showed terrible events like death stalking the land. And of course, you know it well, this is the Great Black Death Plague, the worst plague to hit the planet. It was a function of the actual virus itself, but also impact of population growth. And Malthusian wrote in the 18th century, he said, there is a certain limit to how big cities can grow, countries can grow, and planets can grow in terms of population. And they had at that time in the 14th century, 300 years of tremendous prosperity and growth in population. Cities sprang up everywhere, and this was the resurgence of the Renaissance. And European countries, shown in the bottom right-hand corner, were heavily populated. But also they were concentrated in growing cities. London at this time was 70,000 people, the size of Fort Myers. But most people were farmers and relied on farming for their income. There are a number of perfect storm features here. In 1314 there was a mini ice age where it was wet and cold for 2 years, which destroyed the harvest. And then that led to the Great Famine 2 years later, where 10% of Europe were killed. This is before the Black Death arrived. So the Black Death marches in from the southeast corner of Europe, as you can see. It probably originated from Central Southern Asia. We think Kazakhstan is the most likely initiation point. Within 4 years, 40%, yes, 40% of the population of Europe were dead. So somewhere between 100 and 200 million people had died. And you can see how rapidly it moved up from the warm southeast part of the Mediterranean through Central Europe and even as far as the United Kingdom and into Scandinavia. This was so devastating to Europe that it took 150 years to recover the population, and it was so bad that the French and English, who've been fighting forever, actually put down their swords and declared a truce while both countries tried to recover from the Black Death. This not only had devastating effect on population and food, it also had a huge social change. When you have a significant impact like this, life never continues in the same way as it did before. So we see these terribly depressing pictures being painted, the triumph of death on the top right-hand corner. People blame religion, God has let us down, witch hunts were endemic, had to blame somebody, let's blame the Jews. And so there were popular revolts against the organization to let them down. Wars became longer and more violent. This was a very bad time to be alive in Europe. After the Black Death had come and gone, the countries of Europe found themselves in a different world. Labor short, so they had to pay people more. Serfdom, effectively slavery, swapped over to actually owning or have some control over the land that you worked. Grain, which is very labor intensive, moved on to animals, more animals being husbanded. And people were conscious that one day they may die from such a horrible event, and therefore they started to share their wealth with the people who are going to follow on from them. So wills and inheritance became important. But also, I'll leave you with this last thought, in that because it was so devastating, so many people died, that the concept of community and charity began at this time. And of course, the people turned to the scientists and said, we can't have this again, what can you do to help us? And so medical treatment advances begin slowly in the 14th century. We now have to look to a curse that the Europeans brought with them to the New World. The New World had not ever been contaminated with smallpox. It had been isolated by the oceans, of course, and the very first incidence recorded of smallpox was in Mexico in 1518, brought by explorers. This was devastating. The whole of the New World, North and South America, had no resistance to smallpox, and 90% of the indigenous population of the New World died. Something like 56 million people, the population of England today. Of course, this devastation meant that the armies had declined, and so it was very easy for the conquistadors, in the form of the Hernán Cortés, could easily take on the Aztecs, and Francisco Pizarro moved down south to the Incas and captured them with only a handful of soldiers. And so it was that the indigenous population was horribly weakened, not just the benefit of Spain, but also all the other colonial powers which were coming across the Atlantic, Britain, France, Portugal, the Netherlands. They were all assisted by the fact that the numbers of people to resist them had declined dramatically. There's great stories of misfortune to the Aztecs. The Spanish conquistadors believed that there was a city of gold, El Dorado, and they never could find it, but they tortured the poor emperor. And the reason why the Aztec capital fell was because the Cortés and his men had brought in a year or two before that the smallpox, which devastated and weakened the Aztecs, and they were gone forever. The next disease which affected Central America was an epidemic, which is a viral hemorrhagic fever, killed nearly 15 million people in Central America and Mexico, as you can see from this map. So smallpox had done its deed, and then this other pestilence came in. Salmonella was the cause of this, led to possibly typhoid, and you can see from the graph in the bottom right-hand corner, no sooner had they recovered from smallpox in 1520, the next endemic took place in 1545, and then 1576. This is a devastating impact on the population. By the middle of the 16th century, there's only a fraction of the people left in the New World. England wanted to expand in the early 17th century to colonies in the New World. They didn't want Spain to get the whole of the New World. And so it was that James I, the first Protestant king of England, was put on the throne, and he had his coronation in 1603. He was Protestant and popular, but the coronation had to be postponed because of a plague. It also resisted the number of people who could come and watch him being crowned. 10% of the population of London died at this time. So devastating was it to London that the theatres were closed for a total of 6 years out of the period from 1603 to 1613. But the concept of plague in the 17th century is everywhere in Europe and repeats itself throughout different countries. For instance, William Shakespeare was born at this time in Stratford-upon-Avon, and he was born in the year there was a plague in his town. He moved to London, he wrote 38 plays in London. Every 4 months he produced a new play. Pretty good going. But he had to watch out for the plague in 1605, and all the theatres were closed again. And so he is now nothing to do. He is kept at home, and he wrote 2 really depressing plays, King Lear and Macbeth. And those of you who know Romeo and Juliet will remember the phrase, "There's a plague on both your houses." So during this period of the 17th century, plagues were an everyday occurrence almost, and it infiltrated into the thinking and the writing of people throughout Europe. In 1620, the English pilgrims made their way from Holland to Plymouth and then to the New World. Of course, as I mentioned previously, that in the previous 10 years or so, the number of local residents in the area where they arrived in New England had been devastating. Something like 90% of all the Native Americans were dead by the time they arrived. The Virginia Company had offered them land, but they missed New York and they ended up in Massachusetts. And they made landfall in 1620 in November and said, "We'll just stay here." The Mayflower Pact was an agreement from the Pilgrims to work together. There's no I in team, and they had to sign this agreement before they could set foot on their new land. They were astonished at the area that they discovered because there were villages which were empty. There were skeletons lying on the seashore, signs of death and destruction all around them. Smallpox had wiped out 75,000 people in the area where they landed. But they didn't suffer from smallpox as such, but they were landed in Christmas time, and they hadn't prepared growth for plants, and therefore they starved to death. Half of them lost their lives in that terrible winter. And in fact, those people who survived, something like 10 million Americans claim that they are descended from the Pilgrims today. Meanwhile, back in Europe, there was the worst bloodthirsty war for many hundreds of years before and after. It was called the 30 Years' War, and it tore apart the Christian countries in Germany and Italy. And it was a religious war between Catholics and Protestants, started by the Holy Roman Empire, who wanted to control the Protestants in his empire, and the Protestants disagreed, and so they rose up. And it was the most bloodthirsty battle, and it lasted for nearly 30 years. 8 million people died. 20% of the population of Central Europe died from war, plague, or famine. This led to specific outbreaks of famine, and the most famous is the 1629 Italian plague, which is bubonic plague, and 1 million people in Italy died. This was an atrocious time to be in Europe because bloodletting was everywhere, and the worst example was Magdeburg, a town in eastern Germany today, where 25,000 of the 30,000 inhabitants who were Protestant were massacred by Catholic armies. It was a terrible, terrible event. The plague and the wars were so depressing that down in Bavaria, a year or two after the Magdeburg incident, the concern was that the war was going to come their way, that the plague was going to come their way, and they said that if God spared them from the bubonic plague in Bavaria, they would perform a passion play every 10 years, and indeed God spared them because only one person died from plague in the area of Oberammergau. And so every 10 years, the passion play of Oberammergau is performed since 1633. If you want to get an idea of how horrible this time was, there's a movie, goes back 30 years, called The Last Valley, which characterizes very nicely the combination of massacres and pestilence and starvation. Depressing, but it's very nicely done by Hollywood. The 17th century was the worst time for Europe in many respects. The so-called Spanish plagues, brought in by fleas from rats, came in. The bubonic plague once again. In the late 1600s, there was 8% people died. They went into Holland, they went into Spain, they went to Seville. In Seville, the great southwest city of Spain, 25% of the people died because it was brought in by ship. There was no quarantine at that time. We'll come back to quarantine a little bit later. It devastated the southern part of Spain in 1676. Totally 1.3 million people died in Spain. It was so devastating that the population of Spain was frozen for 100 years. It took that long to recover. Venice couldn't escape. Venice was a great opportunist maritime power at this time who were bringing in high quality goods from China through the Silk Road into the Mediterranean and then on shipping into Northwest Europe. And they made an empire out of this. But in doing so, they actually allowed the smallpox and other pestilences to come across the Silk Road, and they made their way into the Eastern Mediterranean, and Venice was right at the epicenter of these. In 1631, it got very bad indeed. A plague hit Venice, 30%, a third of the population of the whole city died. It was so bad that they wondered whether the city would survive at all, and so they made an agreement that if the plague came to a quick end, that they would build a basilica to Our Lady of Health, which in Italian is called Santa Maria della Salute. And if anybody's been to Venice, you can't possibly miss this. It's on the Grand Canal. It's the thing you see first when you enter Venice by water. It's in the Baroque style, and inside the artwork is all referring to death, particularly the Black Death. It was completed in 1687. This beautiful painting by Canaletto, 1730, gives an idea of how significant it was and how the people of Venice were so pleased that the plague had moved on. And it's a testament to people's faith and optimism. Unfortunately, like all of Venice, it's built on wood and piles, and the wooden piles are gradually sinking under the weight of the masonry into the mud of Venice, and that story is very well known indeed. I said I'd mention quarantine because we are very focused right now on quarantine measures, but quarantine goes back to the Roman times. They realized that this disease was spread from person to person, and so it was that they identified people who were sick and stopped them moving around, and even isolated parts of the Roman Empire to stop one section contaminating another. That was around 500 AD. Same thing going on in China. They also suffered very badly from plagues, as I mentioned. And 600, they detained all sailors who were showing discomfort. The first formal quarantine on this planet was 1348, when Venice had enough of these plagues and said any ship coming into the Venice harbour had to wait at harbour for 40 days. And it's the 40 days which gives us the name quarantine. So quarantine is based on the Latin for 40 days. And London took 200 or 300 years to actually follow this, but by the middle of the 17th century, most of the maritime ports in Europe were applying quarantine measure. Milan was very aggressive in the 14th century. If you were sick, you were taken outside the walls and dumped. Not very friendly people. Marseille, you couldn't enter Marseille in the middle of the 16th century unless you had a medical check before entering. Of course, what would that check comprise, you ask yourself? Looking for boils and blotches, no doubt. And then the 17th century, Frankfurt prohibited any activity in markets, supermarkets for instance, and churches were shut down because that's where a lot of people gathered on a regular basis. So that's quarantine that's been around for nearly 2,000 years. Back to the 17th century again, the worst time in Europe for multiple plagues, and the Great Plague hit London, Bubonic Plague. It was the last time that England really suffered greatly from this plague, this type of plague. But everybody left London who could afford to do so. Even the king skedaddled, Charles II. It started in the spring and it spread rapidly during the hot summer months. Once again, fleas from plague-infected rats brought this into London. The death rate was 100,000 in England, 7,000 people died, and these gruesome paintings appeared where husband and wives were dying together in their miserable hovels covered in these great big boils. Interestingly, plague has a big impact, as I mentioned, on Shakespeare, but it also had a great impact on Isaac Newton. He was born in 1642, and he was an undistinguished Cambridge student, but he actually was brilliant in his own field, but overall didn't quite set the world on fire. And he had this opportunity to become famous in the plague years of 1665, when Cambridge University was closed, so everybody had to go home. In those 2 years, he was really bored, and so much so that in his spare time he invented calculus, which we thank him for. This apple dropped near his head, and he defined gravity, and he, in his spare time, then realized that if you shine light through a prism, it breaks up into its primary colors. And just to keep us all occupied, in the next 200 or 300 years, he developed a reflecting telescope, which allowed us to see the heavens better. He wrote all these great ideas down in the most boring book ever, called Principia. and was published in the late 17th century. And I love the famous quote that he made before he died, and he said, "You're a genius, you know everything." And he said, "To explain all nature is too difficult, much better to do a little with certainty and leave the rest to others." How modest. Of course, we know about this period because Samuel Pepys, the famous diary writer, who for 9 years composed a diary on day-to-day events, and rather raunchy it can be at times. It's uncensored view of what went on in London at that time. He mentioned the coronation of Charles II, he mentioned the plague, the Great Fire, the Dutch attacking the port of Medway. He talked about the people's food and wine and toilet habits. He said how much money he had or how little money he had, and he bought a watch with an alarm, and that made his day. But he complained about his cat waking him up at night. Nothing changes. And he talked about all sorts of relationships he had with females, which we won't go into. And then all of a sudden the diary stopped. Some people think that this writing every night with candles made his eyes deteriorate and he was worried about going blind, and so it's a very defined 9-year period during the plague. Of course, after the plague, everybody was relieved in some way by the Great Fire of London, which cleaned out the old medieval hovels that dominate the city, and very soon London has started again in a new style and had moved westwards. And so it was that plague was followed by the cleansing of the Great Fire of London. By 1815, London was the largest city in the world. It had recovered from the plague, but it took about 100 years. Meanwhile, in France, in the early 18th century, we had Marseille, a maritime power, having succumbed to a plague because of a ship coming in. Once again, no quarantine of ships. The death rate was very significant. 30% of the population of Marseille died. But it's the last of the appearances of the bubonic plagues in Europe. And hygiene improved, quality of life improved, and spacing out of houses meant that the bubonic plague its days were over. But there were things going on in Russia. When you have a plague and 20 to 30% of the people die, it's just shocking to the people who survived. And poor old Catherine II couldn't control the riots that were going on. A bishop was murdered because he hadn't saved them, God hadn't saved them. So she reacted to moving all the factories from Moscow to other cities so they could keep on producing things without risking a plague. 100,000 people died, and after the plague had gone, people felt disenchanted with her rule, and more people died during the insurrection of 1773. So here we have a case of the plague, high mortality rate, leading to civil unrest. We're moving on to new diseases now. In 1793, Philadelphia, coming close to home, suffered from the yellow fever. It's a viral-based fever. It comes from African mosquitoes, and the thought at the time was that black people were immune to this particular fever, and not true, of course, and they tried to recruit black people to be nurses. And that was the concept in Philadelphia. When the mosquitoes died in the winter, the epidemic stopped, but 15% of the population of Philadelphia died. But it was also to be seen, Boston had seen an outbreak in 1693, Norfolk, Virginia, 1855, Mississippi, and so on. And in Central Africa today, yellow fever is alive and well, and something like 30,000 people every year die from yellow fever in Africa. I just mentioned not only plagues were an issue, but also infection generally was an issue, and more people died from the impact of bad nursing or infection after a battle than actually in the battle itself, and that applied in the Crimean War particularly. It also applied in the United States Civil War. So if you were wounded badly, the chances were you weren't going to make it in the hospital. And so the numbers of fatalities in hospitals were so frightening that Florence Nightingale took 38 ladies with her to Istanbul, to the Scutari Hospital, which is alive and well in a hotel today in Istanbul. And she reported 42% of people who entered her hospital from the suffering from wounds in the Crimean War died. So she quickly introduced what we now consider to be absolutely normal, good hygiene measures. She cleaned the hospital floors and walls every day, new bed sheets, blankets every day. Don't allow people to go to the toilet in their beds, which we now consider to be remarkable, but that's what they did in those days. Wash your hands, clean uniforms, better food, clean your bandages and the instruments. Don't pass instruments from one person to another. Stop staff overworking, and within 6 months, the death rate had reduced from 42% to only 2%, and that was the beginning of modern nursing throughout the world. She got the nickname the lady with the lamp because she was tireless. When everybody had gone home exhausted after treating the wounded soldiers, she would make one last trip around the wards, and with her little light to minimize the impact, she checked all the patients were settled down for the night. And a London Times reporter wrote these famous words in 1855, and she became forever the lady with the lamp. Moving on to cholera, in 1817, there's an outbreak in Europe and the United States where 200,000 people died. Later in Russia, 1 million people died of cholera. This is an important crossroads in medical treatment because it's the beginning of scientific analysis of what causes these dreadful events. And William Farr began to collect data. So here we have the first real scientific analysis of why are people dying, why are they dying in certain areas of cholera and not in other areas. And he drew this very simple graph. He just did a simple analysis of where people died in relation to where they lived. And he found that the higher you were in London, altitude-wise, the lower the risk of fatalities. A year later, more work was done in the area of Broad Street. And this is one particular area of London, and 600 people died in one small district. There's something special about this district. And John Snow was curious, and he followed his nose to this pump. And he noticed that everybody in the Broad Street area used this one pump. He took samples from the water, and sure enough, it was contaminated, and it was cholera that was coming through the water and being passed through the water to all the people. This changed modern cities, and within 5 years, London had made sure that sewage didn't just simply go into the ground and where it could contaminate wells, that in fact all of the major sewers in London were pumped out to sea, and cholera never raised its ugly head again. So there's a case of scientific analysis leading to a solution. The last of the bubonic plagues is now about to haunt us, and it started off in China. China was going through a dreadful civil war which went on for 16 years, similar to the American Civil War at the same time. And during this war, plague broke out, and it moved on to India, and 12 million people in totality died in the middle of the 19th century. This was a terrible time to be in China. Wars, starvation, pestilence. 40 million people died in China during this period from these factors. And the last bubonic plague affecting Europe and America and China in 1855, but in 1960, people are still dying from the bubonic plague elsewhere in the world. Now we come on to the late 19th century flus, and we go a little bit here into detail, and this is a picture taken by a scanning electron microscope, and these are tiny, tiny, tiny viruses, and they're called H2N2 is this particular one. And the earliest case of this particular virulent flu was in Russia, hence the name Russian flu, and it spread from St. Petersburg, and eventually it spread around the globe. It did so because at this time in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, people were traveling fast steamship, railways, and so the spread was astonishing. Within 5 weeks, you were a goner, 1 million people died. The fatality, interestingly for us, was 4% of all the people who got the flu died. The next flu, of course, is infamous, the famous Spanish flu, misnamed completely. And because the King of Spain caught the flu and survived, it became known as the Spanish flu, but in fact started in Europe, and it was a result of the First World War. This is a different version, it's the H1N virus, and it came from pigs. Just a brief aside, most of the diseases that we've been talking about originated from human contact with animals. And these viruses have been around for tens of thousands of years. They only enter into into humanity when some freak event occurs where they transferred from an animal into the human source, and that's why these catch us out from time to time. 50 million people died from the Spanish flu, something like 5% mortality rate, and the effect of the First World War and the terrible conditions and the poverty and the lack of food led to this outbreak. It was an interesting Spanish flu because it targeted young people and healthy people, which is unusual. So this was quite different from other flus. Going off in a bit of a tangent was a 1920s dreadful disease called polio, which has been mostly eradicated today, but in the 20th century it was a very severe problem for those people who caught it. 6,000 people died in the 1920s, mostly children, and those children who were affected by the polio epidemic were left with permanent disabilities. And I remember as a kid at school, one of the people in the class had suffered from polio and had a leg brace. That was a very, very visible example of polio. In fact, FDR got polio and he had the same problem. His legs were weakened and he needed braces from then onwards. Fortunately, Salk in the United States found in 1954 a vaccine, and the last polio case in the United States was 1979. So there's a case of science stepping up and finding a vaccine, and polio hopefully is a thing behind us, but not yet completely gone in poorer parts of the world. Just a few pointers on flu viruses. The influenza virus called H1N1, we're going to start off with, is the most common cause of human flu. And just a little bit of biology for a moment. Here's a picture of a scanning electron microscope of a tiny, tiny virus cell. And you can see the two features here. You can see the red bits, which are hemagglutins, and the neuraminidase, these enzymes. So there's two separate items attached to the surface of this virus. And it's how they morph actually allows the virus to change into different types. And it allows them to move onto the body, and they are constantly changing and morphing, and I'm going to take you through that position in a moment. So the H1N1 and the H1N2 depends on how many of these H and N items are attached to the virus. Let's start off with 1957, the Asian Bird Flu, as it's called. This was an H2N2 avian virus, started in China. As I mentioned to you earlier, these things come from animals, and it came from wild ducks. Fatality was fairly modest, 0.2%, and 2 million people died. But it spread from China into the west coast of the United States, and 70,000 people died in the 57-58 outbreak. And you can see on the bottom right-hand corner here how these flus morph over time. They're all originating at one time together, but they're constantly developing. The Hong Kong flu in 1968 was an H3N2, a new version of this virus. It was based on the 57 outbreak, but different. And it first appeared in Hong Kong, hence the name, in 1968. Vietnam War troops brought this back to the United States. Fairly low fatality rate, 0.5%, because people had been resistant to the previous outbreak, the H2N2. 1 million people died. This time, mostly the people over 65 years. And 100,000 people died in the United States. And this is an idea of how small these little guys are. This is multiplying the image by 100,000. This is a virus. In 1981, a new terror came to the world, and this is another example of, we call it AIDS, and this had been around for 100 years. From now, and it came from chimpanzees in West Africa. Somehow it moved from chimpanzees into humans, and it's called a human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, and there is that pesky little guy on the right hand side is an HIV virus. If you are infected by this, your immune system can be overloaded, and then you develop what's known as AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. This was devastating to the world. There's no resistance to it in human form. 35 million people died and became a pandemic in the late 20th century. It is still active in Africa, and HIV is still surviving in sub-Saharan Africa today. This is a map which shows where HIV is still surviving, and it was almost a death sentence. It was almost fatal. And then in the 1990s, the medical profession stepped up and began to develop anti-AIDS virus protection, and people who had HIV didn't necessarily develop the full AIDS. And of course, this was brought into high focus by the movie with Tom Hanks, the Philadelphia movie, if you remember. It highlighted AIDS, of course, but also highlighted our issues over over homosexuals. So it's a very powerful crossroads for a number of reasons. Amazingly, this year, still being confirmed, but it seems that 2 people have been cured completely of HIV, which is the first time that's ever happened, although it was very expensive and very specific by changing people's bone marrow, so not an everyday treatment. Now we come on to the very current issue that we're all concerned about, which is the coronavirus. It is in very simple, mild form, just a common cold, but also can develop into a killer. And we know that from the outbreaks we're going to talk about in a moment, which is SARS, MERS, and now, of course, COVID-19. It's named corona because when you look at the virus under electron microscope, it looks like the virus has got a ring of red additions, as shown on the right-hand side. It looks like a corona surrounding the active part of the virus. It goes back to 8000 BC. Bats who were found going back to that period had the coronavirus, so it's not a new virus. In 1960s, it was discovered in chickens, and then it passed on to humans, and it's spread through, as we know, respiratory droplets. We now move on to 2002, when the first SARS-CoV-1 was observed. And SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. And it's a strain of the dreaded coronavirus, as we talked about. And this came from horseshoe bats in caves, and it passed to small cat-like creatures called civets in southeast China. Again, spread by respiratory droplets, and it has a 3-month curve. And this graph on the right-hand side shows the development of cases and also deaths. But in 2002, the first outbreak of the coronavirus in recent times was fairly modest. 600 people died in China and Hong Kong. There were no fatalities that we know about in the United States, although it went for people over 65. There they suffered a high mortality rate, 55%. But because it was fairly minor and short-lived, not too much work was done on developing a vaccine, and we'll come back to that in a minute. There's no vaccine developed for SARS, and the last case disappeared in 2004, as you can see from this graph. We were sidetracked by a new pest, which is swine flu. And this is a strain of our old friend, the flu, H1N1. The Spanish flu, 1918, was similar to this. It was in pigs. It was originally in Mexico, and it spread to humans, affected 1.4 billion people. But again, not a big killer. Only 200 to 500,000 people died worldwide. You compare that to 60,000 people who died from a normal flu problems in the United States, and that puts it in perspective. The swine flu of 2009 affected children and young adults. 80% were younger than 65. And because older people had been through the H1N1 epidemic before, and you can see on the right-hand side graph here that the darker areas show where most of the casualties were. The vaccine for the H1N1 virus that caused the swine flu is now included in your annual flu vaccine. It's one of those that we know about, and you'll be inoculated in your multiple injection. The next one was called MERS, which is Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, and this is a coronavirus again, 2012 and 15. We probably remember this just about. It started in Saudi Arabia. It originated in bats, and it passed to camels and into humans. There were only 2,000 cases, mostly in Saudi Arabia. 800 people died, and there's no vaccine. It moved on to South Korea for a short period, and it's still around, but it's minor in its effect. Moving to a different virus, in 2014-16, the Ebola epidemic took place, and it was the first, in 1976, the first cases of this new virus cropped up in Africa, in Sudan Congo. Once again, it started in bats, and it spread not by respiratory droplets, but by blood contamination. And it ravaged West Africa, so Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone, also Nigeria, Mali, Senegal, Central, and West Africa suffered in 2013. Modest numbers of cases, 11,000 people. There is still no cure for Ebola, and there's the creature on the right-hand side. Another virus was 2015, and it's still wandering around. That's why I put a question mark on when it's going to end. It's a Zika virus, and this map on the right-hand side shows you the countries where it's more prevalent. It started in Africa and Uganda, went to Central and South America. It likes warm, wet climates, so occasionally you see some outbreaks in the southern part of the United States. It started with mosquitoes, and it passes from human to human by sexual transmission, and it doesn't affect the lives of adults and children. It affects the babies inside the woman womb, and so the impact of the Zika virus is in birth defects. The epidemic grew in 2015 and is gradually declining in those countries shown in the map. And now, just to put things in perspective as we come to the end of this talk, this is in chronological order the various evil pandemics and epidemics which have affected us in modern times. So the Antonine Plague we talked about, the Justinian Plague, Japanese smallpox, Black Death you can see there, then smallpox itself in the 17th century, and then cholera, the Bubonic Plague comes back again, the yellow fever is there, the Spanish flu, very significant, and HIV, very significant, and then we move on to modern times where the numbers of people are dying are less and less, until we come to this slide where you can see how significant the bubonic plague was. 200 million people died in those days. Smallpox, 56 million, Spanish flu, 50 million, and the Roman flu, about 50 million. And then we carry on in the lower part, and you can see that HIV/AIDS is the most dangerous in recent times for us. And then you can see right at the very bottom where we stand today at the end of March, where as of today, 33,000 people have died from COVID-19 around the world. But right now, I wanted to show you this graph because it puts it in perspective. We have to keep this in perspective. This is nowhere near as bad as the devastating plagues of the past, although very, very sad indeed for those people who get it. We can look back and say, were we being diligent? The 2003 SARS coronavirus outbreak occurred again in 2004 and 2005 with variations. Then the MERS version came up in 2012, that was 9 years later. 7 years later, our current pandemic starts. In December last year, in China, in a city called Wuhan, it moved from bats into humans, and it was called COVID-19, which means coronavirus disease. 19 meaning 2019. On 11th of March this year, 2020, it was declared a pandemic. So far, the indication is that the average mortality across the globe, both in Europe and Asia, is about 5%. But for those people who are 80 years and older, as this graph shows you on the right-hand side, they are susceptible to a much higher fatality rate. We've heard a lot recently about flattening the curve. What does that mean? It means that if you take this dotted line running horizontally, where it says capacity of healthcare system, this is what our medical profession can handle without overloading staff and equipment. So the objective is to try and make sure that people are treated speedily so they can recover. If you don't control the movement of people, the spread of the virus is very high, and you can see the red peak here shows that it's over in a quicker period of time, but you overload the health system so people cannot be treated, and therefore the fatality rate is higher. So in the 1847 outbreak of typhoid, two cities were compared, Baltimore, which introduced control of people moving around, and Philadelphia, which didn't. This led to this graph of flattening the curve. So if you can actually control people moving around, then hopefully you can keep the incidence of people suffering to a level which the health system can handle it. So that's what we're trying to do. It prevents an overload of the health system. This is the latest picture I have at the end of March, where you can see the United States has now become the focus of the world. China is flattening off. And Italy and Spain are charging ahead, and you can see the typical 3-month cycle for all those countries, some on the upward swing, some maturing. And of course, I have to take a light-hearted view if we can in such difficult situations. Of course, people are amazingly resilient, and when they're stuck at home, bored, working from home, they make up these funny little cartoons which go around and cheer us up from time to time. And here's a toilet roll bouquet. And I like the one on the right where this is my panic room because of the panic buying of toilet rolls. Thank you, Lauren, my daughter, for sending me that. Update, as of the end of March, the world has had 730,000 cases, 33,000 deaths, which is about 5%. 5% of people who get disease die. United States, much lower percentage of fatality, only 2%. Italy, much higher, 12%, Spain higher. In Florida, where we live, very low incidence of death rate versus the cases. That we are very, very fortunate in Florida compared to the rest of the United States. I finish off with just a message for the future, in that we saw in 2002 the coronavirus doing its job. Did we drop the ball? Did we actually pursue this as well as we could have done with regard to a vaccine? And it's easy to look back and say, oh yeah, sure, we can criticize the past. But in fact, in 2005, a paper was written by the CDC called SARS Vaccine Development. This is SARS-1 effectively. And they pleaded for developing an effective and safe vaccine which urgently needed to prevent infection by SARS of the coronavirus. So this was laid down in 2005. The issue here is how long it takes to develop a vaccine. At the very, very best, it's 2 years, but it could be as much as 10 years. So people are saying, when are we going to have a vaccine for the current outbreak? And it could be around about the summer of 2021. We hope much faster. But what happened here was that the SARS outbreak was short in duration and small in impact. No fatalities in the United States, so we deliberately or accidentally reduced our funding to find a vaccine. And I'll leave you with this gruesome 17th century doctor. If he comes knocking on your door, do not let him in. Thank you for your time today. I hope very soon we're back to normal, giving these talks face to face, and I wish you the best.